Have you ever wondered why fasting attracts so much of God's attention? It seems contradictory that something as simple as not eating could have so much power, but that's exactly what Jesus taught us. And what if I told you that while you're fasting, there are some dangerous pitfalls that could completely nullify your efforts? That's right, many people make common mistakes that end up stripping fasting of its spiritual value. It may sound strange, but fasting the wrong way can be just as harmful as not fasting at all. That's why today, you'll discover what you should never do while fasting and how to turn this practice into a true bridge to God's heart. Fasting is more than a spiritual option. It is a direct call from Jesus to his followers. In the Sermon on the Mount, he didn't say, "if you fast," but "when you fast," making it clear that it's an expected practice, just like prayer. For many, fasting seems distant or reserved for extremely religious people, but the truth is that anyone can and should pursue this practice. A clear example of this is the early Christians, who included fasting in their routine, not as an option but as a way of life. So, have you ever wondered how fasting could transform your life? When you fast, you're not just abstaining from food, you're demonstrating deep obedience and faith. Imagine fasting as a spiritual workout. Just as weightlifting strengthens the body, fasting strengthens the soul. By following Jesus' command, you directly connect with God's will, making room for him to work more intensely in your life. And, of course, this is not an easy task. After all, we are bombarded with temptations all the time, but overcoming those temptations is part of the strengthening process. Fasting is often associated only with food deprivation, but it goes much further than that. When fasting, you begin to realize that you're distancing yourself from everything that distracts your spirit, and this includes even negative thoughts, emotional vices, and things you didn't even know were pulling you away from God. Think about how fasting can also include moments of silence, without social media or television. A complete fast is not just about food, but also emotional and spiritual, allowing a rebirth of your connection with the divine. Now, if you're wondering how to put this into practice, just start simply. Jesus doesn't expect you to fast for 40 days right away. Begin with something small, a day without social media, a morning without coffee, or even a few hours dedicated to silence and prayer. As you feel this practice deepening, you'll see how fasting can transform your attitudes, thoughts, and even your relationships with others. And as fasting becomes a regular practice, the domino effect begins. Your relationship with God strengthens, spiritual answers become clearer, and your spirit aligns with divine will. But what comes after this spiritual journey? The next step leads us to an essential point in the fasting process: the humbling of the soul. Fasting is not just a physical exercise, but a deep journey of humbling the soul. In the Psalms, we find several passages showing how fasting teaches us to recognize our total dependence on God. Imagine yourself as a tree whose roots need to sink deep into the earth to survive. Just as the tree depends on water, our soul depends on God. Fasting brings us to this state of humility, reminding us that without God, we are like dried trees in barren soil. When we fast, it's as if we're emptying our pride. Our society values independence so much, but fasting teaches us the opposite. It shows us that we need to acknowledge our weaknesses and, more importantly, our total inability to control everything around us. During fasting, there's no room for masks. It forces us to face the reality of who we are, and this humility is what makes room for God to act more powerfully in our lives. Think of how many times pride has kept us from hearing God's voice. Many people find that during fasting, their inner struggles become more evident. This is natural because, by humbling the soul, we are confronting our own inner demons, our fears, and insecurities. It's at this moment that fasting reveals its true power. It brings us to our knees, spiritually speaking, and makes us cry out for help. When we recognize our total dependence on God, we begin to trust Him more, letting go of that incessant need for control. Applying this to practical life, fasting is an opportunity to reflect on which areas of our lives we are being prideful. Perhaps it's in work, relationships, or even the way we handle our emotions. During fasting, take time to pray and ask God, "In what areas do I need to be more humble?" As you acknowledge these areas, you will begin to see transformations in how you deal with daily challenges. Imagine how liberating it would be to let God guide your life without the weight of pride holding you back. This humbling of the soul is not something negative, but a true liberation. When we humble ourselves before God, He elevates us to new spiritual heights. And as you begin to experience this deeper connection with God, One of the first things that changes is the way you pray. The next step is to see how fasting, in addition to humbling the soul, strengthens your prayers. Fasting has a unique power to intensify our prayers, and this is clearly demonstrated in the Bible. In Daniel 9 verse 3, we see the prophet turning to God with fasting, in an even deeper spiritual pursuit. It's not just about what we say, but how we present ourselves before God, with a broken heart and a soul thirsty for His presence. Fasting is like turning up the volume of your voice in the spiritual realm, bringing an urgency and intensity that might otherwise be lacking in your prayers. During fasting, our prayers take on a new dimension. By depriving yourself of something essential like food, you are showing God, and yourself, that He is more important than any physical need. This completely changes the tone of your prayer. Imagine someone who, when fasting, places themselves in a state of total surrender. Every word spoken in prayer carries more weight because it comes from a place of deep dependence and spiritual focus. Your prayers stop being routine and become more sincere and full of faith. A practical example of this is when you're seeking answers for something important. Instead of just praying as usual, adding fasting to your spiritual search shows God that you are truly committed to hearing His voice. It might be a crucial decision about work, family, or even health. When fasting, you align yourself spiritually, allowing your prayer to be clearer and more direct. Try fasting when divine direction seems distant, and you'll see how the answers start to become clearer. Moreover, fasting helps us maintain a firmer focus during prayers. How many times have we started to pray only to be distracted by thoughts or daily worries? Fasting eliminates many of these distractions because you are consciously removing something from your life to create space for God. It's like tuning an instrument before playing. You prepare spiritually so that your prayers resonate harmoniously and effectively in the spiritual realm. And when this harmony happens, the effect can be transformative. However, strengthening your prayers through fasting doesn't mean that answers will always come immediately. Sometimes fasting is an exercise in patience and persistence. It is in this process that spiritual strongholds begin to be torn down, but this is a crucial point that we'll address next. Fasting is a powerful spiritual weapon that has the potential to tear down the strongholds that hold us captive. In Isaiah 58, God makes it clear that the fasting He desires is one that frees people from the chains of oppression. Spiritual strongholds, such as deep fears, addictions, and destructive behavioral patterns, are often maintained in our lives by invisible forces. Fasting allows us to break free from these bonds because when we place ourselves in a state of total dependence on God, we weaken the influence of these forces. Think of how many times we've felt that something is preventing us from moving forward, and fasting may be the key to breaking those barriers. When you fast, you are stepping into a spiritual battlefield, but not as someone vulnerable. You are armed with the strength that comes from depending on God. Imagine a fortress surrounded by impenetrable walls. Fasting is like a spiritual sledgehammer that, blow by blow, begins to tear down those walls. Whether it's toxic relationships, past traumas, or even doubts that sabotage your faith, fasting has the power to make these strongholds fall. However, it's important to remember that these victories aren't always immediate, but persistence in fasting brings significant results. It's remarkable how the practice of fasting, combined with prayer, can bring to light areas in our lives that were hidden, further strengthening the process of healing and liberation. Many people realize during fasting that certain habits or thoughts they considered harmless are actually spiritual strongholds. Through continuous prayer and fasting, God reveals these areas and gives us the strength to overcome them. An example of this is when someone fasts to break free from addictions that seem impossible to overcome. By bringing these struggles to light during fasting, liberation becomes more tangible. In addition to breaking personal strongholds, fasting can also set others around you free. Have you ever heard of people fasting for others? This happens because fasting isn't just an individual tool. It can be used to intercede for friends and family members who are trapped in cycles of oppression. When you fast for someone, you're essentially asking God to tear down the strongholds that are preventing that person from living fully. Prayer, combined with fasting, has a much deeper and more effective power of intercession. And while you experience this spiritual liberation, it's important to remember that fasting should be done genuinely, not with the intention of impressing others. This leads us to the next point: the mistakes to avoid when fasting. Fasting is a powerful spiritual practice, but it can lose its value if done with the wrong motivations. One of the biggest mistakes people make is fasting to impress others. Jesus warned us about this, emphasizing that we shouldn't fast with a gloomy face, as the Pharisees did, just to show others they were fasting. True fasting is between you and God, and when the goal is to attract the attention of others, the spiritual value of this practice is completely lost. For those just starting, it's essential to remember that fasting is an intimate moment with God and should remain that way. Another common mistake is turning fasting into a disguised diet. Some people see fasting as an opportunity to lose weight, but that goes against the spiritual essence of the practice. While fasting can have physical benefits, like cleansing the body, the main focus is the purification of the soul. Avoiding food and replacing it with other goals like weight loss diverts the person from the true intention of fasting. What God desires is for us to abstain from something significant to strengthen our connection with Him, not to simply follow a diet trend. Fasting is about surrender, not aesthetics. Using fasting as a way to pressure God is another mistake to avoid. Some people believe that by fasting, they are forcing God to answer their prayers faster or in the way they want. However, fasting is not a tool for spiritual bargaining. God is sovereign, and while fasting can intensify our prayers, it doesn't change God's will. Think of fasting as a process of aligning your will with God's, not the other way around. If you enter fasting with the intention of manipulating the outcome of your prayers, the spiritual effect will be null. Moreover, a less noticeable but equally important mistake is neglecting the mental and spiritual preparation for fasting. Often, people start fasting without proper preparation, and this can result in discouragement or frustration. It's crucial to begin fasting with the right heart, knowing exactly why you're fasting and what you want to achieve spiritually. Taking time to pray before starting the fast can help avoid distractions and maintain focus on the purpose. After all, without purpose, fasting completely loses its value. Finally, when breaking the fast, many people make the mistake of ending it abruptly and unhealthily. The body and mind have undergone a deep process, and reintroducing food should be gradual. This brings us to the last crucial point: how to end fasting correctly. After a period of fasting, the body and mind are in a sensitive state, and it's essential to reintroduce food in a gradual and careful manner. Many people make the mistake of returning to large portions or heavy foods immediately after fasting, which can cause discomfort and even harm the body. The best approach is to start with light, nutrient-rich foods such as fruits, cooked vegetables, and soups. This care allows the body to adjust gradually, avoiding overloading the digestive system, which has been resting. Remember, fasting was a process of purification, and returning to food should reflect this care. Another important aspect of ending fasting is to maintain the same spiritual disposition you cultivated during the process. It's not just about returning to eating, but about continuing the connection that was deepened with God. Often, people feel great relief when the fast is over, but they forget that the real change doesn't come from the act of fasting itself, but from what is learned and transformed during the fast. Therefore, when you return to eating, keep the focus on what you gain spiritually, such as a new perspective or a more humble heart open to God's will. Whether in short or prolonged fasts, gradually reintroducing food also involves wisdom in choosing what to eat. Many experts suggest starting with liquids, like natural juices and broths, before moving on to more solid and substantial foods. This not only protects the body but also helps prolong the spiritual and physical benefits of fasting. A simple example would be starting with a vegetable soup, rich in nutrients, and avoiding highly processed or fatty foods, which can be harsh on the digestive system still recovering. Moreover, ending the fast is the perfect time to reflect on everything learned and put into practice the new insights gained during the period of abstinence. Perhaps you've realized that you can live with less than you thought, or that certain temptations can be avoided more easily. The end of fasting doesn't mean the end of transformations. On the contrary, it's the beginning of a new phase of discipline and spiritual clarity. Therefore, when returning to food, also take time for self-assessment on what can be maintained in your daily life, whether in your diet or your spiritual life. Finally, breaking the fast correctly is both a physical and spiritual act. Caring for the body reflects caring for the soul, and this balance between the physical and spiritual is what makes fasting a transformative experience. Now that you know the whole process, from the start of fasting to its completion, what more can we learn about the power of fasting? Let's dive deeper into what draws God's attention when we fast. Now that you've learned about the mistakes to avoid and how fasting can truly attract God's attention, the question is, how will you apply this knowledge in your life? Are you ready to transform your spiritual life with practices that really make a difference? Fasting is a powerful tool, but it only works when used in the right way. Have you been fasting with the right heart? Or have you fallen into some of these traps? This is the time to do things differently. How about starting a fast with purpose, seeking not just external change but true inner transformation? If you want to keep learning more about how to grow spiritually and avoid the mistakes that so many make, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always stay up to date with new teachings that will help you connect even more with God. Let's walk together on this spiritual journey.